The morning she stepped off the train at Harlan Junction, there was no one waiting. She had not expected anyone. The letter had said someone would meet her at the depot by 7, and it was already past 8, and the station master had already swept the platform twice and gone back inside. She stood with her trunk at her feet and her coat buttoned against the October wind, and she looked west toward the hills, which were the color of old rust, and she decided the hills were the most honest thing she'd seen since she crossed the Nebraska line. The advertisement had run in the Omaha Courier in late September. She had read it sitting in the back of a milliner's shop where she'd been alterating hat brims for 6 weeks. The kind of work that paid just enough to keep a person from making better decisions. Sheep Station, Eastern Montana Territory, seeking capable woman for domestic and station work. Arrangement by mutual agreement. Respond by post. Box 14 Harlan Junction. She had read it twice, folded it into her coat pocket, and gone back to the hat brims. Then she read it again, at night by candlelight, and thought about the word capable and what it asked of a person versus what it assumed. She had written back the same evening. Now she stood on the platform with the wind pulling at her coat hem and watched a wagon come down the main road from the north. It was moving without urgency. A single horse, a bay with a white sock on the near foreleg, pulling a flat wagon with 2 empty crates on the back. The man driving it sat with the reins loose in his hands, the way a man sits when he is not thinking about driving. He was not old. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that he looked like a person who had recently stopped bothering about something important and was still deciding whether to start bothering again. He pulled up at the end of the platform and looked at her trunk first, then at her. She let him look. He said he was sorry he was late. He said it the way a man says something he does not entirely mean, but means enough to say. She picked up the smaller of her 2 bags before he could, and he climbed down and lifted the trunk into the wagon without asking. He had a slight hesitation in the movement, a catch at the right hip that he covered by turning away at the last moment. She filed that away. The drive out took the better part of an hour. She watched the country change. The flat broke open into low rolling hills, and the hills gave way to a creek valley with cottonwood running the banks in yellow October color. The sheep station sat at the north end of the valley where the land rose slightly. A sod house with a timber addition on the east side. 2 long low sheds that would be the sheep pens, and a barn that had once been painted red and was now the color of something that had given up being red. She counted the flock as they came down the road. Less than 100 head, she thought. Possibly 80. The pasture to the west could have held twice that, maybe more. The grass was still good this late in the season, taller than it should be in the low areas, which meant it had been undertaxed all summer. A person had to have eyes to see what the land was not being asked to do. She had learned that from her father, who had been wrong about almost everything except land. She did not say any of this. He stopped the wagon at the house, and she stepped down before he came around. The front of the house had a single step, which had been repaired recently enough that the wood was still pale and unweathered. The door hung straight. She noticed that. Someone had rehung it recently. The hinge screws were new. She noticed the window on the south side had a crack sealed with what appeared to be pine pitch, done carefully, not hastily. There were things here that had been tended to and things that had not, and the line between them told her something. Inside, the house was 2 rooms. The main room held a cook stove, a table with 3 chairs, shelves above the stove with provisions stacked in no particular order, a settle along the wall that had been used as a bed. At some point, recently, the blanket on it folded without precision. The second room was visible through an open door, a proper bed made up with the tight corners of a man who had been taught to do that, and still did it for reasons that had outlasted whoever taught him. She stood in the main room and looked at the shelves. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, a tin of coffee, 2 tins of something she could not identify from where she stood, a half-empty sack of salt, a clay jug that had been stoppered with a rag. She crossed to the stove and opened the firebox. Warm ash, not cold. He had banked it before he left, which was either habit or foresight, and either spoke well of him. He had come in behind her and stopped near the door, which seemed to be his preferred position, halfway between inside and not. She said, "The flock." "How many head?" He said, 78. She said the pasture to the west would carry 120 in a dry summer. He didn't answer immediately. She had not asked a question. He said he knew. She asked when he had last run the full count. He said 3 weeks ago. She said, I'll want to do a walkthrough tomorrow before the light goes. He said she could. She asked if there was a dog. He said there had been. He said it without elaboration, and she heard the shape of something in the pause after it. She didn't ask what had happened to the dog. Some questions were invitations to a room you could not easily leave. She made supper from what was on the shelves, beans that had been soaking, which meant he had put them to soak the night before, which meant he had been thinking about her arrival longer than his lateness suggested, salt pork, cornbread from meal and water because there was no buttermilk. She made it without ceremony and set 2 plates on the table and sat down. He sat across from her. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the yellow leaves came loose and scraped against the window glass. She said, "Tell me about the lambing." He said it had been poor the last 2 springs. She asked why. He said they'd had wet weather in April both years, cold that came back after the ewes had already dropped. He said he'd lost close to 30% the first year and held it to 20 the second. She calculated this against what she'd seen in the pasture. "What's your ram situation?" He set his fork down, not with frustration, she decided. More with the look of a man who had not been asked practical questions in some time and was recalling that he knew the answers. He said he had 3 rams. 2 of them were older, from his father's original flock. The third he'd bought at a sale in Miles City 2 years back, a merino cross he'd been told would improve the fleece weight. She asked if it had. He was quiet a moment. He said the fleece was finer, but the lambs from that ram were smaller at weaning and seemed to hold cold less well than the older bloodlines. She looked at him across the table. She said, "Keep the old rams." He looked back at her. She said, "A dead lamb is worth nothing. A slightly coarser fleece on a living animal is worth something." He picked his fork back up. He ate for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have said the same thing." She didn't respond to that. She heard the weight in it, the kind of weight that comes when a person references someone in the past tense for the first time in a new person's presence. Testing the air. After supper, she went outside to look at the sky. It was a clear night, the first cold that would deepen into something serious. The stars were sharp and closed the way they only got at altitude. She walked the perimeter of the near pasture fence in the dark, running her hand along the wire. In 2 places, it had been repaired with knots that would hold for now but not for a hard winter. She noted the locations by their relation to the fence post, a cedar post, and then a cracked juniper post, and filed them. On the south side of the second shed, she found a stack of lumber under an oilcloth. New-cut boards, pine, still pale. Someone had bought materials for a project and not yet started it. She lifted the oilcloth edge. The boards were dry. They had been covered carefully. Whoever had put them there had intended to come back for them. She put the oilcloth back the way she found it and walked to the barn. The barn held 4 horses, 2 of them work animals, 1 a young mare that had been recently shod, and 1 an older gelding that stood at the back of his stall with the particular stillness of a horse that had decided to conserve everything it had. She stood with the lantern and let the horses settle to her presence. The young mare came forward and pushed her nose against the stall rail. That told her about the mare's handling. Someone had spent time with her. The gelding did not move, but his ear tracked her as she walked the length of the barn. He was watching without committing. She understood that. Along the east wall, hung from a series of pegs, were 3 lambing kits, clean, the instruments laid in order. Below them, on a low shelf, were 3 ledgers bound in canvas, stacked with their spines outward. She took the topmost one down and opened it. The entries began in 1881 in a hand she did not recognize. Fine script, very regular, with the careful spacing of someone who had learned to write later in life and was proud of the result. Birth dates, fleece weights, illness notes, breeding pairs, all of it organized by season and year. She turned to the back. The last entries in the fine hand were in the spring of 1890. Then a gap of 2 weeks, and then a different hand, larger, less regular, continued without ceremony. She looked at the date of the transition. She looked at the 2 lambing kits hanging clean on the wall and at the 3rd kit beside them. She put the ledger back exactly as she found it and carried the lantern to the far end of the barn where the feed was stored. The hay was good quality, better than she expected. The oat bins were lower than they should be for October, but not critically so. There was a crock of lanolin sealed with a wood lid, and a coil of marking paint wire hung from a square nail that had been driven with precision. One strike she could tell by the shape of the dimple in the wood around the head. A man who drove a nail in one strike had done it 10,000 times before. She came back to the house. He was still at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He did not look up when she came in, but he was aware of her. She could tell by the slight straightening in his back. She hung her coat on the peg inside the door and went to the stove and added a piece of wood. The fire had burned lower while she was outside. She said, "I found the ledgers in the barn." He looked up, she said. 3 of them, the first 2 in a different hand. He was quiet a moment. He said, "My father's." She said, "The entries stop in April of 1890. He said, "Yes." She did not ask any further about it. She sat down at the other end of the table and pulled the nearest ledger toward her, the one she had brought in from the barn. She opened it to the lambing records from the previous spring and began to read. He watched her do this without speaking. After a few minutes, he went back to his paper. The pencil moved in short strokes. She could see it was figures, columns, the kind of arithmetic that didn't resolve itself no matter how many times you ran it. She read for an hour. When she looked up, he had set the pencil down and was sitting with his hands flat on the table looking at nothing in particular. She said that you from lot 7 in the spring records. She threw twins both years and both sets survived. He said, "Hattie." She said, "What?" He said, "That's what my father called her. I kept the name." She looked down at the ledger. There beside the entry was a small notation, in the older hand, H, circled. She had not known what it meant. She said, "Which of the current U's are descended from her?" He thought about it. He stood and came around to her side of the table and bent over the ledger, his hand moving along the page. He pointed to 3 notations. She could smell hay and cold air on his coat. He straightened and went back to his chair. She picked up the pencil from the table. She wrote the U numbers in the margin. She said, "These 3 need to be the last ones you'd sell." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He looked at her. She said, "You have a note coming due. I can see it in the paper you were working on." He said, "January." She said, "What's the shortfall?" He told her. She kept her face the same while he said it. The amount was not catastrophic, but it was serious. It was the kind of amount that looked like a definite number, but was actually a question about character. Whether a person would cut the wrong things to make it, or find a way that didn't require cutting anything permanent. She looked at the ledger again. She said, "You have the Merino Cross Rams. They're not serving you well. They would serve someone else well if that person was breeding for fleece weight over hardiness. Someone on lower ground, milder winter." He was quiet. She said, "There's a market for them if you take them to the right buyer," he said. "Miles City," she said, "or east. The dealers coming through Harlan Junction in November are from Bismarck. They buy for lower altitude stations," he said. "How do you know what dealers come through Harlan Junction in November?" She said, "I read the trade notices in the Courier before I answered your advertisement." He was quiet again. The stove ticked. Outside, the cottonwood branches knocked against each other in the wind. He said, "What else did you read?" She said, "Enough to know this place had potential the advertisement didn't mention." He looked at her for a moment, not with suspicion, with something closer to the look of a man standing at the edge of something and not being entirely sure it was solid. He said, "The advertisement was honest." She said, "It was incomplete." He said, "I didn't know what to put." She understood that. There was a thing that happened to a person when grief and struggle ran together long enough that they ceased to be able to see their own situation from the outside. The land was still good. The flock still had the bones of something worth building on. The records were kept. The tools were maintained. The lumber under the oilcloth was dry. These were not the signs of a man who had given up. They were the signs of a man who had slowed almost to stopping, but had not yet stopped. She said, "Go to sleep. I want to walk the full perimeter before sunrise." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She heard him go into the back room. She sat at the table for a while longer and read 2 more seasons in the ledger. Then she banked the stove fire, with the care of someone who had learned to do it right the first time, and went to the settle along the wall and laid down with her coat over her, and was asleep before the fire settled. He was up before her, which she had not expected. She woke to the smell of coffee already made and the sound of him moving in the yard. She pulled on her boots and coat and stepped outside into a pre-dawn that was the deep gray blue of good wool and cold enough to see breath. He was at the near pasture gate. He had already brought the 2 workhorses out. He held one set of reins and looked at her when she came out, without saying anything about the hour. She took the second horse's reins without being asked, and they walked out into the valley while the darkness was still deciding to leave. She walked and she looked. She said nothing until she had something to say. The creek ran along the west boundary of the property, and she walked its bank from the northern end to where it bent south. The water was low for October, which told her something about the summer runoff, which told her something about the snowpack above. In 3 places, the bank had been cut by sheep pushed to water in the same narrow corridor repeatedly. The grass was gone in those cuts, and the mud was dark and soft even now in the cold. She stepped back from each one and looked at the angle of the bank and thought about what one season of fencing that corridor would do. He watched her look. He had stopped asking what she was seeing. He seemed to have decided that she would say it when she was ready and not before, which was a quality she appreciated in a person. Many people filled silence because they were afraid of what it held. He filled it only when it needed filling. At the south end of the property, there was a meadow she had not been able to see from the road. It sat in a bowl between 2 low ridges and held a different quality of grass than the upper pasture. Greener, even now. She crouched and pulled up a handful and looked at the root length before she let it fall. She said, "Does this flood in spring?" He said. "It held standing water through May most years." She said, "Do you run the flock through it?" He said, "Not until June when it dried." She said, "Move that date to mid-May and rotational graze it in sections. The root depth is good. You're leaving 6 weeks of the best grazing on the property unused." He looked at the meadow. He looked at it the way a person looks at something familiar that has just been described to them from an angle they couldn't see before. He said, "My father let it rest until June because of the flooding." She said, "The flooding was 10 years ago. You've drained the north side. Look at the grass." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I didn't think about that." She stood. She said, "You've been managing for the problems that used to be here. Some of them aren't here anymore." They continued the perimeter. By the time they came back around to the gate, the sun was fully up and burning the frost off the grass in small columns of steam. She stood at the gate and turned to look back at the full sweep of it. The valley, the creek, the meadow, the sheds, the flock moving slowly in the near pasture. The barn with its red paint gone to rust color. The lumber under the oilcloth. He stood beside her. She said, "You have enough here." He looked at the property. He said, "For what?" She said, "For what you're trying to do." He turned his head slightly. He said, "I'm not sure anymore what I'm trying to do." She said, "You kept the records, you bought the lumber, you banked the fire before you left this morning to get me." He didn't say anything. She said, "A man who has stopped trying doesn't do those things." She went inside and made breakfast and ate it standing up, reading from the second ledger with one hand. He came in and ate without sitting down either. They did not talk about the conversation at the gate. Some things did not need to be carried back inside. She spent the afternoon in the barn with all 3 ledgers open on the feed crate beside her and a piece of paper she had found folded in the back of the second ledger, blank on one side. She wrote in 2 columns. One column was the flock as it stood. One column was the flock as it could stand in 3 years if the right decisions were made in the right order. She did not write quickly. She crossed things out. She went back to the records and confirmed dates before she committed to numbers. Picture that emerged from the pages was not what she had expected when she started. She had expected to find a flock that had declined from neglect. What she found instead was a flock that had been held carefully but held still, like water dammed up behind a decision that had never been made. His father had been building towards something in the breeding program. She could see it in the records going back to the fine hand years. Not fleece weight, not size. The notations in the older ledger came back again and again to 2 qualities: hardiness, Constitution, and once, in a margin, a single phrase so small she had to tilt the page, for the bad winters. His father had survived something, she didn't know what, but it had shaped every breeding decision he had made for the last decade of his life, and his son had continued those decisions without fully understanding why. And the result was a flock that was, despite everything, deeply suited to exactly the kind of winters this valley produced. She told him that evening. He sat with it for a long time. He said his father had come to Montana from Minnesota in the winter of 1878. He said the crossing had killed 2/3 of the flock they'd trailed up. He said his father had never spoken about it at length, only in the oblique way of a person who carries something they have learned not to say directly. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the careful entries in the fine hand, the circled notations, the small private symbols. She said, he wrote it into the records instead. He looked at her. She said, everything he couldn't say about that winter, he put into the breeding program. Every year, he was trying to build an animal that wouldn't die the way those animals died. He was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the door in slow, persistent pulses. He said after a while, he died before he saw whether it was working. She said, you saw whether it was working. You were here for the spring of 1891. He said, we lost 7 head. She said, what did the neighbors lose? He looked up. She said, I read the trade notices from that spring before I came. A station 3 miles east of Harlan Junction lost 40% of their flock in the February freeze. Another south of the creek lost 60. What did you lose? He said. 7. She said, 7 out of 78. He was quiet again. She pulled the page she had written toward him and turned it so he could read it. She had written it clearly, the 2 columns, the current state and the possible state, the decisions that led from one to the other. She had used his father's notation system without thinking about it, had absorbed it from hours with the ledgers, and had simply begun to think in it. He read the page slowly. She watched his eyes move. He read it twice. He said, this would take 3 years. She said, yes. He said, the note is January. She said, the merino crosses will cover the note if you move them before November. What's left is enough to carry through winter, he said. And after January, she said. After January, you have what the land has always had. You just have to let yourself use it. He set the page down. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He said, why did you come here? She understood what he was actually asking. It was not a question about the advertisement. She said, I had a farm once, with someone else, in Iowa. She stopped. She started again. There was a flood, spring of 88. 3 days. She looked at the ledger instead of at him. I know what a place looks like when it's been stopped, but not ended. I know the difference. He was very still. She said, this place has been stopped. He looked at the table again. She said, I want to see whether I'm right about the meadow and about the older rams. That will take at least through the lambing season. He looked up. She said, maybe 2. The fire shifted in the stove. Somewhere outside, one of the horses moved in the barn, a slow knock of hoof against stallboard. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said, the second room is yours if you want it. She said, I know. She went to sleep on the settle that night anyway, by choice, because she was not yet ready to move, and because not everything had to be decided at once. The lambing season came in March, and it was hard, in the way lambing seasons are hard on high ground. Cold that returned without warning, ground frozen in the mornings and soft by noon and frozen again by dark. She worked the nights when it was necessary and the days when it was not. She learned the flock individually, their patterns and their exceptions which ewes called and which were silent, which lambs needed watching, and which found their feet before she had time to worry about them. He worked beside her. He knew the flock in the way a man knows things he has lived with for years, bone deep, past language. She knew them differently, from the outside, from the records, from pattern. Together they knew them better than either of them did alone, and both of them understood this without saying it. The older of the 2 original rams threw 14 lambs that season. She kept count on a piece of paper tucked in her coat pocket. 11 survived the worst cold snap in the 2nd week of March, a drop of 30 degrees in 4 hours. A station to the east lost 20% of their new lambs in that same snap. She heard about it from the mail carrier who came through the valley on the 15th. She did not say anything to him about the numbers. She didn't need to. He could count. By April, she had moved into the back room. Not because she had decided to stay, because the settle was too short for a full night's sleep, and there was a real bed, and she was very tired. She told herself it was practical. Some things you let yourself believe for a while before you admit the whole truth of them. The summer was drier than the ledgers predicted for a typical year. She used the meadow as she had said she would, rotating the flock through in sections, watching the grass recover behind them in the rich, dark soil. The creek ran lower than she liked, but did not go dry. She fenced the cut banks in May with the lumber from under the oilcloth, took 3 days of work and used all of the boards. By June, the grass was coming back in the cuts, thin but real, the roots finding purchase in the softened mud. He was there for the fencing. He handed boards. He did not offer opinions about where to place the posts because she had already placed them and they were in the right locations, and he could see that. He drove the nails in one strike. She noticed. In September, the wool buyers came through Harlan Junction, and she went with him to the sale. She did not speak at the table. She stood to the side and watched the buyers look at the fleece samples, and she read their faces. When one of the Bismarck dealers lingered over the clip from the older ram's lambs, she caught the expression before he had time to compose it back to neutral. After the sale, walking back to the wagon, she told him what she had seen and what she thought it meant for next year's prices if the flock composition shifted even slightly. He listened. He always listened. She had known that about him since the first evening when she had told him about the south fence being down, and he had simply set his fork down and taken it in. No argument, no defense. That quality was rarer than it should have been in a person. They drove back to the valley in the last of the afternoon light, the hills gone gold on the west sides, the creek catching pieces of sky between the cottonwoods. She watched the land come back to her as they came down the valley road. The fenced cuts. The meadow, grazed down now for the season, but neatly so, no waste. The near pasture where the flock moved in their slow late-season drift, he said. You were right about the meadow, she said. I know, he said. And the rams, she said. I know, he said. What were you wrong about? She thought about it, she said. The lambing window. I moved it 2 weeks earlier than I should have. We lost 2 lambs to cold in the first week that we might not have lost if I'd been more conservative. He nodded slowly. She said, I'll adjust in the spring, he said. We'll adjust. She looked at the road ahead. He did not repeat it. He did not need to. He had said it once, plainly, and let it sit. The second lambing season proved what the first had suggested. The flock held through a late freeze in April that took heavy losses up and down the valley. The mail carrier brought the news from 3 different stations in the same week. She listened and kept her face the same. She knew what the numbers meant for the following year's prices. She knew what it meant for the reputation of a station that consistently came through the hard years whole. It was the 3rd season before anyone outside the valley began to ask where those sheep were coming from. A buyer from Chicago, passing through Harlan Junction on his way to the Territory coalfields, stopped at the station on the recommendation of the Miles City dealer he had done business with for 6 years. She was in the near pasture when he arrived, sorting the yearlings from the older animals by a method she had worked out over 2 seasons that saved half the time of the conventional approach. She did not stop what she was doing. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hand and watched her work for a long time. He asked afterward where she had learned to read a flock like that. She said, from a ledger. He looked confused. She said, from a man who thought 30 years ahead and didn't get to see it. He bought the best third of the clip at a price she had not expected to get for 2 more years. She did not show what that meant to her while he was there. When his wagon was gone down the valley road, she stood for a while at the fence with her hand on the top rail and looked at the flock and thought about a man she had never met who had written small, careful words in a ledger by lamplight in a cold year in Minnesota and had begun, in that darkness, to build something he could not yet see the shape of. She thought about her father, too. The way he had taught her to look at land, not searching for what you wanted to find, but letting what was true announce itself. The marker at the edge of the south pasture, the white painted board she had noticed in her first week, was visible from where she stood. She had learned in the 2nd month whose grave it was. His mother, dead the winter of 1889, the same winter the fine-hand entries stopped in the first ledger. He had not told her. She had found it in the county records when she went with him to Harlan Junction to file the note satisfaction in January of that second year. And she had read the date and understood without needing to say so, and they had driven back to the valley in the kind of silence that is not empty but full. She had not brought it up. Some things a person carries in a particular way, and the carrying is their own. What she knew, and what she believed she knew, was enough. 40 years later, a woman came through the valley on her way from Billings to the northern ranching country. She was young, looking for land, carrying a notebook with questions she had written down and not yet had answered. She stopped at the station on the advice of a dealer in Miles City who told her the people there knew sheep, the way other people knew their own names. The man who met her at the gate was older, unhurried. He pointed her toward the near pasture where a woman, gray-haired and spare in her movements, was walking the flock with the particular attention of someone who sees everything and comments on very little. She moved without waste. When she stopped for a reason. When she moved on, she had already seen what she needed to see. The young woman watched her for a while and then asked the old man how long she had been doing that. He said since before he could remember doing anything else. The young woman said, "Did she always know this much about sheep?" He thought about that. He said he supposed she had known it when she arrived. He said what she had added, since then, was something harder to name. He said he thought it was the particular knowledge that comes from learning one piece of country so well that you stop seeing what it is and start seeing what it could be. The young woman wrote that down in her notebook. He watched her write and said nothing else. Across the pasture, the gray-haired woman had stopped walking and was standing very still, looking at something in the flock that the young woman with the notebook could not yet see. She stood like that for a long moment, and then she moved quietly, with precision, exactly toward the place that needed her.